The snow was falling sideways when Hiram Whitfield died. November in Windham County. Connecticut had always been a month of preparation, a month of stacking the last cordwood against the barn wall, a month of checking the cabin's north-facing boards for gaps that would whistle when the northwest wind came down from Canada in December. A month of counting and measuring and calculating how much warmth a family would need to survive until April. But on that particular November morning in 1856, none of the preparation mattered. Martha Whitfield found her husband in the horse stall. He was lying on his side in the hay, his right hand still gripping the curry brush, his left hand pressed against his chest, as if he had been trying to hold something inside that was determined to escape. The horse stood in the corner of the stall watching her with the patient incomprehension of an animal that had witnessed something it could not understand. Martha was 50 years old. She had been married to Hiram for 31 years. She had borne him 3 children, buried 2 of them before they reached their 5th birthdays, and raised the surviving one into a man who now stood behind her in the barn doorway, unable to speak. Daniel was 24. He had his father's broad shoulders and his mother's careful eyes. He had been hauling water from the well when Martha's scream had reached him across the frozen farmyard, and he had dropped the buckets and run without feeling the cold water splash across his boots. Now he stood in the doorway of the horse stall, looking at his father's body, and he did not know what to do with his hands. Martha did. She knelt beside Hiram and touched his face. His skin was still warm. The apoplexy had taken him quickly. She could see that. The expression on his face was more surprise than pain. He had been brushing the horse one moment and dying the next, and the transition had been so swift that his body had not had time to register the full weight of what was happening. She closed his eyes with her fingertips. She had done this twice before for the 2 children who had not survived their earliest years, and her hands remembered the motion, even though her mind was somewhere else entirely, somewhere in the 31 years of mornings when she had woken beside this man, somewhere in the accumulated small moments that had added up to a life. The horse shifted in the corner. The snow continued to fall sideways outside the barn door. The wind that had been building since dawn pushed against the barn's west wall with the steady pressure of something that would not stop until spring. Martha stood up. She looked at Daniel, who was still standing in the doorway with his hands at his sides and his face the color of the November sky. She said the only thing that needed to be said in that moment: "We need to bring him inside." They buried Hiram 3 days later in the small cemetery behind the Congregational Church where Martha's parents were buried, and where her 2 lost children lay in graves so small that the headstones looked like they belonged to a different species entirely. The ground was not yet frozen solid, but it was cold enough that the gravediggers had to work for most of a day to open the earth to the depth that decency required. The Reverend Hoskins spoke words that Martha heard without listening. The neighbors stood in a semicircle around the grave, their breath visible in the cold air, their faces wearing the particular expression of people who are attending a funeral and thinking about their own mortality. Silas Brennan was there from the farm to the east. Calvin Moore was there from the farm to the north. Old Samuel Crawford was there, leaning on a cane that his grandson had carved for him the previous winter, his eyes watery with age and cold, and perhaps something else. Martha stood at the edge of the grave and watched the first shovelful of dirt fall onto her husband's coffin, and she thought about firewood. This was not the thought she was supposed to be having. She knew that. She was supposed to be thinking about Hiram's soul ascending to whatever reward awaited men who had worked hard and complained little and loved their families in the quiet way that New England farmers loved. She was supposed to be thinking about the 31 years and the 3 children and the accumulated weight of a shared life. But Martha had been a practical woman for 50 years, and practicality did not pause for grief. The firewood pile beside the barn was 3/4 full. She had counted the cords that morning while Daniel was washing and dressing his father's body for burial. 3¼ cords remaining. If the winter followed the pattern of the previous winters, she would need approximately 3½ cords to keep the cabin warm enough for survival. She was short by a 1/4 cord, and Hiram was no longer there to cut it. Daniel could cut it. Daniel was strong enough and skilled enough, and he had been helping his father with the cordwood since he was 12 years old. But Daniel was also the only remaining labor on the farm, and the farm required more than cordwood. The farm required fencing repairs and livestock care, and the 100 small tasks that Hiram had distributed across the available hours without ever seeming to run out of either tasks or hours. Now, Martha would have to distribute those tasks. Now, Martha would have to decide what got done, and what got delayed, and what got abandoned entirely. Now, Martha would have to run the farm that her husband's grandfather had cleared from the Connecticut wilderness in 1798, and she would have to run it alone. The second shovelful of dirt fell onto the coffin. Martha watched it fall. She thought about the northwest wind that was already building behind the gray November clouds. She thought about the gap in the north wall of the cabin where the board had shrunk over the summer and would need to be shimmed before the real cold arrived. She thought about the 1 cord of firewood that the Whitfield farm always seemed to burn more than the Crawford farm, and how Hiram had never been able to explain that difference in the 40 years he had been measuring it. The third shovelful of dirt fell. Martha turned away from the grave and began the walk back to the farm that was now hers to save or lose. The first winter after Hiram's death was the winter when Martha learned to count. She had always been good with numbers. Her father had taught her arithmetic when she was young. Not because he believed girls needed arithmetic, but because she had asked, and he had not known how to refuse a child who asked to learn. She had kept the household accounts throughout her marriage, tracking the small expenditures and incomes that added up to a farm survival. She knew the price of salt and the yield of a good corn harvest and the cost of hiring day labor during the August hay cutting. But she had never counted firewood the way she counted it that winter. Every morning before the sun rose, she would walk to the woodpile beside the barn and count the remaining cords. She would calculate how many days had passed and how many cords had been burned and what the daily rate of consumption was. She would look at the sky and guess at the temperature and factor in the wind that she could feel pressing against her face through the darkness. By December, she had a number. The Whitfield farm was burning approximately 1/40th of a cord per day. At that rate, the 3½ cords they had started with would last until early March. If the winter was mild, they would survive with firewood to spare. If the winter was harsh, they would run short in February. But the number that troubled her was not the consumption rate. The number that troubled her was the comparison. Samuel Crawford's farm was half a mile to the southwest on a lower section of the same east-facing slope that the Whitfield farm occupied. The Crawford cabin was older than the Whitfield cabin by 15 years. The Crawford cabin had been built when Samuel Crawford's father was still alive, and it had been built with the materials and techniques of an earlier generation. By every reasonable measure, the Crawford cabin should have been less efficient than the Whitfield cabin, but the Crawford farm burned approximately 2.5 cords of firewood per winter. The Whitfield farm burned approximately 3.5 cords, 1 cord difference, every winter. For 40 years, Hiram had noticed this difference when he was a young man, and he had spent 4 decades trying to explain it. He had attributed it to the Crawford cabin's slightly newer roof. He had attributed it to the Crawford family's habit of banking their fire earlier in the evening. He had attributed it to some ineffable quality of Crawford luck that seemed to extend to firewood as easily as it extended to corn yields and healthy livestock. But he had never solved the puzzle, and now Martha was staring at the puzzle from the other side of a grave, and she was beginning to see something that Hiram had never seen. The wind. The northwest wind that came down from Canada every winter was not hitting the Crawford farm the same way it was hitting the Whitfield farm. Martha had known this in some peripheral way for years, the way you know that water runs downhill or that certain fields drain better than others. But she had never thought about it systematically. Now she did. The Whitfield cabin sat on an east-facing slope with no natural protection to the north or west. When the northwest wind came, it struck the cabin's north and west walls at a direct angle. It pressed against the boards. It found every gap, every shrinkage crack, every place where the chinking between the logs had dried and crumbled. It stole heat through the walls by convection. It forced cold air into the cabin through infiltration. The Crawford cabin sat on a lower section of the same slope, but it sat below a ridge, a natural ridge of glacially deposited stone that rose 30 feet above the cabin on its north and west sides. When the northwest wind came to the Crawford farm, it hit the ridge first. And then something happened. Martha was not sure what happened, but she was sure that something did. The wind was different on the Crawford farm. The wind was weaker. The wind was less constant. The wind did not seem to press against the Crawford cabin with the same relentless force that it pressed against the Whitfield cabin. The ridge was doing something to the wind. Martha spent the rest of that first winter watching the wind and thinking about what the ridge might be doing. She did not yet have a theory. She did not yet have a plan. She had only an observation and a question. The observation was that the Crawford farm burned less firewood than the Whitfield farm. The question was, why? January 1858. 14 months after Hiram's death, the second winter of Martha's solitary management, the winter when she decided to stop asking questions and start looking for answers. The blizzard had been building since dawn, a northwest blizzard, the kind that came 3 or 4 times each winter, the kind that lasted for 2 or 3 days and left drifts as high as a man's waist. By mid-afternoon, the visibility was down to a few dozen yards, and the temperature had dropped to somewhere below 0, and any sensible person was inside by a fire. Martha was not inside. She was walking up the slope toward the ridge that protected the Crawford farm. Daniel had tried to stop her. He had stood in the cabin doorway with his arms crossed and his face set in the particular expression of a son who believes his mother has lost her mind. "You cannot go out in this," he had said. You will freeze before you reach the Crawford Ridge." "I will be back within the hour," Martha had replied. "I need to see something." What could you possibly need to see in a blizzard? Martha had looked at her son. He was 26 now, 2 years older than he had been when his father died. 2 years of running the farm's physical labor while his mother made the decisions. 2 years of watching her count firewood and measure temperature and make notes in a small journal that she kept beside her bed. He did not understand what she was doing. She knew that. He thought she was grieving in some complicated way that he could not follow. He thought she was trying to solve a puzzle that did not need solving because the puzzle was just the way things were and had always been. He did not understand that she was trying to save the farm. The one cord of extra firewood that the Whitfield farm burned every winter was not a minor inefficiency. It was a drain. It was labor that Daniel had to spend cutting wood instead of repairing fences. It was money they could not spend on seed or livestock or tools. It was time stolen from the farm's other needs and fed into a stove that ate more than it should. If Martha could find a way to reduce the farm's firewood consumption to match the Crawford farms, she would gain the equivalent of one cord of labor every winter. She would gain the margin that might make the difference between survival and failure in a bad year. She needed to see the ridge in a blizzard. She needed to see what the wind did when it hit the ridge. She wrapped herself in her heaviest wool coat and tied a scarf across her face and walked out into the horizontal snow. The walk to the Crawford Ridge took 20 minutes. The wind pushed against her from the northwest constant and fierce driving snow into her eyes whenever she turned her face in that direction. She kept her head down and her shoulders hunched, and she counted her steps the way she counted everything else. 400 steps to the base of the ridge. Another 50 steps up the slope to the ridge's crest. She stopped at the crest and turned to face the wind. The full force of the blizzard hit her. The wind was so strong that she had to lean into it to avoid being pushed backward. The snow was so thick that she could barely see her own hands when she raised them in front of her face. The cold was so intense that it burned her skin through the scarf. She bent down and scooped a handful of snow from the ridge's surface. She opened her hand. The snow flew sideways, horizontal, driven by the wind as if it had been fired from a gun. It did not fall. It flew. Martha nodded to herself. This was what she had expected. This was the wind as it existed on the north side of the ridge before the ridge did whatever it did. She walked down the south side of the ridge into the lee of the stone and earth that the glaciers had deposited 10,000 years before. 10 steps down the slope, 20 steps, 30. She stopped. She bent down and scooped another handful of snow. She opened her hand. The snow fell at an angle, not horizontal, not vertical. Somewhere between. Perhaps 40 degrees from vertical, perhaps 45. The wind was still present, but it was weaker. It was a fraction of what it had been on the north side of the ridge. Martha stood in the snow and felt the difference on her face. The burning cold was gone. The pressure of the wind against her body was reduced. She was still in a blizzard. But she was in a different blizzard than the one on the other side of the ridge. The ridge was not stopping the wind. The ridge was making the wind go somewhere else. She looked up. Through the driving snow, she could see nothing. But she understood now what she would see if she could see it. The wind was not disappearing at the ridge. The wind was going up and over the ridge. The wind was rising above the ridge's height and continuing southward at a higher altitude, passing over the Crawford farm without touching it. The Crawford farm was in the wind's shadow. The wind was above the farm instead of through the farm. The ridge had lifted the wind over the buildings instead of allowing it to strike the buildings directly. Hiram had thought the Crawford cabin was more efficient. Hiram had been wrong. The Crawford cabin was protected. Martha walked back to her own farm through the blizzard, and she thought about what she had seen. The ridge was 30 feet high. It was made of glacially deposited stone and earth. It was a natural feature that could not be replicated, but the principle could be replicated. If a 30-foot ridge could lift the wind over the Crawford farm, could a smaller barrier lift the wind over the Whitfield farm? The Whitfield buildings were smaller than the ridge. The wind shadow they needed was shorter. Perhaps a barrier of 5 feet would be enough. Perhaps 6 feet. Perhaps 10. Martha did not know the exact height that would be required. She did not have the mathematical formulas that would later be called aerodynamics. She did not have wind tunnels or pressure gauges or the accumulated knowledge of engineers who would not be born for another century. But she had fieldstone. The Whitfield farm had been accumulating fieldstone since 1798. Every spring when the frost heaved new stones to the surface of the fields, those stones had been collected and stacked along the field borders. 60 years of plowing had produced enough fieldstone to wall the farm's 20 acres at 3 rows deep. The stone piles along the east field border alone contained hundreds of tons of material. Martha did not need to quarry stone or buy stone or transport stone. She had stone. She had more stone than she could use in a lifetime. She had the raw material for a wind barrier already present on her land. The question was whether a fieldstone wall could do what the Crawford Ridge did. The question was whether she could build a ridge of her own. By February 1858, Martha had a plan. She drew it in her journal, sketching the lines with the careful precision of someone who had learned draftsmanship from observation rather than instruction. The drawing showed the Whitfield cabin and barn from above, with the woodshed between them and the farm road leading away to the south. To the north of the buildings, she drew a wall, 60 feet long, 5 feet high, running parallel to the cabin and barn's north face at a distance of approximately 15 feet. At the east end of the wall, she drew a return wall, 20 feet long, turning south toward the farm road. At the west end of the main wall, she drew another return wall, 20 feet long, turning south toward the barn. The 3 walls together formed a U-shape open to the south, enclosing a protected zone where the cabin barn and woodshed sat. Martha studied her drawing for a long time. The north wall would face the northwest wind directly. When the wind struck the wall, it would have to go somewhere. It could not pass through 5 feet of solid fieldstone. It would have to go up over the wall, rising above the buildings and continuing southward at a higher altitude. The return walls would prevent the wind from curling around the ends of the north wall and entering the protected zone from the sides. They would extend the wind shadow laterally, ensuring that the entire farmyard was within the zone of reduced wind speed. If the design worked, the cabin and barn would be in the same position relative to the stone wall that the Crawford buildings were in relative to the ridge. They would be in the wind's shadow. The wind would be above them instead of through them. If the design worked, the Whitfield farm's firewood consumption would drop. Martha did not know if the design would work. She had no precedent to point to. She had no engineer to consult. She had only her observation of the Crawford Ridge and her understanding of what the ridge seemed to be doing. But she had made a decision. In April, when the ground thawed enough for construction, she would begin building a wall. The church gathering in April 1858 was the monthly social event that brought the farms of northeastern Windham County together. It happened on the first Sunday after Easter in the fellowship hall behind the Congregational Church, and it served the dual purpose of worship and gossip that most rural social gatherings served. Martha had attended these gatherings for 31 years as Hiram's wife. She had stood with the other farm wives and discussed children and gardens and the price of fabric. She had listened to the men discuss crops and weather and the slow accumulation of political grievances that would eventually become a war. This was the first April gathering she had attended as the sole manager of the Whitfield farm. The conversation was different when you were the decision maker. Silas Brennan found her near the punch bowl, where she was pretending to consider a second cup of the weak cider that passed for refreshment at church gatherings. Silas was 55 years old, a bachelor who had inherited his father's farm at the age of 30 and had run it alone ever since. He was known in the community for his strong opinions and his willingness to share them without invitation. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I hear you are planning some construction this summer." News traveled quickly in Windham County. Martha had mentioned her plan to Daniel, and Daniel had mentioned it to the hired hand he was considering for the summer work. And the hired hand had mentioned it to his cousin, who worked for Silas Brennan. The chain of gossip had completed its circuit in less than a week. "I am," Martha said. "A stone wall on the north side of the cabin. A stone wall." Silas repeated the words as if they contained some hidden meaning he was trying to decode. What manner of stone wall? "A wind barrier, 60 feet long, 5 feet high, with return walls on the east and west ends." Silas's eyebrows rose. 5 feet was unusual for a Windham County fieldstone wall. Most walls in the region were 2 to 3 feet high functional boundaries for livestock or property lines. A 5-foot wall was a statement. A 5-foot wall required explanation. "And what is this wind barrier intended to accomplish?" Silas asked. Martha had prepared for this question. She had practiced her answer in the mirror, speaking to her own reflection, as if it were a skeptical neighbor. She had anticipated the objections and the mockery and the simple incomprehension that would greet any idea that fell outside the established categories. "The northwest wind strikes my cabin and barn directly," she said. "It steals heat through the walls and forces cold air through every gap. I burn 1 cord more firewood per winter than Samuel Crawford, whose buildings are protected by the ridge above his farm. I intend to build a ridge of my own." Silas stared at her. Behind him, Calvin Moore had drifted closer, drawn by the tone of the conversation. Calvin was 60 years old, a deacon of the church and a man who believed that tradition existed because previous generations had already discovered what worked. "You intend to build a ridge," Silas said slowly, "out of fieldstone." "Yes. To block the wind. To redirect the wind. The ridge does not block the wind. It makes the wind go up and over. I intend to do the same." Silas exchanged a glance with Calvin. The glance contained an entire conversation, conducted in the silent language of men who have known each other for decades and who share certain assumptions about the world. "Mrs. Whitfield," Silas said, You might as well build a dam to hold back the rain. The words hit Martha like the northwest wind she was trying to redirect. She had expected skepticism. She had not expected dismissal, so casual, so complete, so delivered with the confidence of a man who had already decided the conversation was over. "A dam does hold back the rain," she said. "That is what dams do. A dam holds back water because water cannot rise. Water goes down. Wind goes everywhere. A 5-foot wall will not stop a wind that is 100 feet tall. The wind will simply go over your wall and continue exactly as it did before." Calvin nodded in agreement. "The wind is not a river, Mrs. Whitfield. You cannot dam it with stone." Martha felt the heat rising in her face. The heat of anger, not of embarrassment. The heat of a woman who had spent 16 months counting firewood and measuring temperature and walking through blizzards to understand something that these men had never bothered to investigate. She thought about the snow test on the Crawford Ridge, the horizontal snow on the north side, the angled snow on the south side. The difference that she had felt on her face, the reduction in wind pressure, that had been as clear as the difference between noon and midnight. She thought about Hiram, who had wondered about the one-core difference for 40 years without ever climbing the ridge to investigate. She thought about the stone piles along the east field border waiting. "I'm not trying to stop the wind," she said. Her voice was quiet, but something in its quality made Silas pause. "I am trying to make it go somewhere else." The fellowship hall was not silent. The other conversations continued around them, the ordinary noise of a community gathering. But in the small space where Martha stood facing Silas Brennan and Calvin Moore, there was a stillness. Neither man understood what she had said. She could see it in their faces. The concept she was describing did not fit into their categories. A wall either stopped something or it did not. A barrier either blocked something or it was pointless. The idea that a barrier could redirect rather than block, could deflect rather than halt, could make something go somewhere else rather than stopping it entirely. This idea was outside their experience. Silas recovered first. "Make it go somewhere else," he repeated. "Mrs. Whitfield, the northwest wind has been going exactly where it goes since before your grandfather cleared this land. It will not change its path because you stack some fieldstone in front of your cabin. The Crawford Ridge changes its path. The Crawford Ridge is 30 feet of solid rock. Your wall will be 5 feet of stacked fieldstone. The principle is the same." Silas shook his head. The conversation was over as far as he was concerned. He had heard what he needed to hear, and he had rendered his judgment, and there was nothing more to discuss. "Build your wall if you wish, Mrs. Whitfield. It is your stone and your labor. But do not expect the wind to obey you simply because you have decided it should." He walked away toward the group of men near the door. Calvin lingered a moment longer. "He is not wrong," Calvin said quietly. "The wind does not obey anyone. It never has." Martha looked at him. "I am not asking the wind to obey me," she said. "I am asking the stone to redirect it. The wind will do what the wind does. I am changing what the wind encounters, not what the wind is." Calvin considered this. His face showed something that might have been the beginning of understanding or might have been simply the puzzlement of a man confronted with a distinction he had never previously considered. Then he shook his head and followed Silas toward the door. Martha stood alone beside the punch bowl. The cider was warm. The fellowship hall was emptying. The April afternoon was fading toward evening, and she needed to walk back to the farm before dark. She set down her cup and walked to the door. Daniel was waiting outside, standing beside the wagon they had driven to the church. His face held a question he did not need to ask. "They think I am building a dam to hold back the rain," Martha said. Daniel nodded. He had expected this. He had tried to warn her. "Are you still going to build it?" Martha looked at her son, 26 years old, strong and patient, and loyal in the way that sons were loyal to mothers who had raised them through difficult years. He did not understand her plan any better than Silas Brennan did, but he would help her anyway because she was his mother, and because the farm was his inheritance, and because he had learned from his father that sometimes you did things you did not fully understand, because the people you trusted asked you to. "Yes," Martha said. "I am still going to build it." They climbed onto the wagon seat. Daniel took the reins. The horse began the slow walk back to the farm that would either be saved or lost in the coming years. Martha sat beside her son and thought about the wall she would begin building in 3 weeks. 60 feet of fieldstone selected and stacked in the interlocking courses that 2 centuries of Windham County tradition had developed. 5 feet of barrier against a wind that had been flowing across this land since before the glaciers retreated. She was not trying to stop the wind. She was trying to make it go somewhere else. Somewhere else was above the cabin, above the barn, above the woodshed. Somewhere else was the sky instead of the walls. Somewhere else was the path that the wind would follow once it encountered the stone that it could not pass through. The stones would not stop the wind. The stones would redirect it. This was the idea that Silas Brennan and Calvin Moore had dismissed. This was the idea that she would prove or disprove with 60 years of accumulated fieldstone and 1 summer of labor. The wagon rolled through the April twilight, and Martha counted the days until construction could begin. The first stone was lifted on the 12th of May, 1858. Daniel had hired 2 day laborers from the village of Eastford, 8 miles to the south. Their names were Thomas Meeker and John Slade, and they were young men in their early 20s who had come north looking for summer work and had found it on a farm where a widow wanted to build an unusually tall stone wall for reasons they did not entirely understand. Martha paid them 40 cents per day, which was the prevailing rate for unskilled labor in Windham County. She fed them dinner at midday, which was the prevailing custom. She explained what she wanted built, which was not the prevailing practice for any wall they had ever constructed. 5 feet, Thomas Meeker had said, looking at the stakes Martha had driven into the ground to mark the wall's location. "That is taller than most boundary walls." "It is not a boundary wall," Martha had replied. "It is a wind barrier." Thomas had exchanged a glance with John. The glance contained the same skepticism that Silas Brennan's glance had contained at the church gathering, but it was tempered by the practical consideration that Martha was paying them 40 cents per day, and they were not being paid to have opinions about the purpose of the wall. "Yes, ma'am," Thomas had said. 5 feet it is. They began with the stone pile along the east field border. This was the largest pile on the farm, accumulated from 60 years of spring plowing on the most stone-dense field. The pile was approximately 40 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 4 feet high at its center. A small mountain of glacially deposited fieldstone that had been waiting for a purpose since before Martha was born. The work proceeded in the manner that Windham County stone walls had always been built. Daniel and the two laborers carried the stones from the pile to the wall side, a distance of approximately 200 feet. They laid the stones in courses fitting them against each other, without mortar, relying on the weight and friction of the stones themselves to hold the wall together. But there was one difference in the Whitfield wall construction that neither Thomas Meeker nor John Slade had encountered before. Martha selected the stones. She did not carry them. She was 52 years old, and the larger field stones weighed 60 to 120 pounds, and carrying was work for younger backs and stronger arms. But before any stone was carried to the wall side, Martha examined it. She walked the stone pile each morning with Daniel pointing to the stones that should be moved that day, explaining where each stone would fit in the growing wall. This one, she would say, touching a flat stone with a surface approximately 2 feet square. This is a capstone. It goes on the top course when we reach that height. Set it aside. This one, she would say, touching a long, narrow stone perhaps 3 feet in length. This is a crossing stone. It spans the joint between two stones below and locks the courses together. We need it for the second course on the west section. This one, she would say, touching the wedge-shaped stone with one thick end and one thin end. This fills the gap between the two irregular stones we placed yesterday. The thin end goes in first. Daniel listened to his mother's selections and carried the stone she indicated. Thomas Meeker and John Slade listened and carried as well, though they understood less of what Martha was explaining and cared even less about understanding. But Martha knew what she was doing. She had been reading the Whitfield stone piles for 40 years. She had learned to read them the way other people learn to read books. The field stone of Windham County was not uniform. Each piece had a shape determined by the fracture patterns of the original rock and the grinding of the glaciers that had transported it. Some pieces were flat and regular, suitable for the visible faces of a wall. Some pieces were long and narrow, suitable for spanning joints and locking courses together. Some pieces were irregular, wedge-shaped triangular, suitable only for filling the gaps that regular stones inevitably created. A good wall required all three types of stone in the proper proportions. A good wall required the flat stones on the outer faces, the crossing stones spanning the joints, the irregular stones filling the gaps. A good wall required each stone to be placed in the position where its particular shape contributed to the wall's overall stability. This was not something that could be learned in 3 weeks. This was not something that hired laborers could be expected to know. This was the accumulated knowledge of decades spent on a single piece of land, learning its particular stones and their particular shapes, and the particular ways they fit together. Martha had this knowledge. Daniel was learning it. Thomas Meeker and John Slade did not have it and would never have it, because they would leave at the end of the summer and never return to this particular stone pile on this particular farm. Martha's journal entry from May 1858 recorded her understanding of the situation with the precision she brought to everything she measured. Daniel and the men carry, she wrote. I select. The selection is the skill. A stone that does not fit its position will shift when the ground freezes and the wall will lean. A stone that fits well will stay. I have been reading the stone piles on this farm for 40 years. I know which piece goes where better than a laborer who has been at the pile for 3 weeks. This was not arrogance. This was simple observation. The laborers were strong and willing, but they did not know the stones. Martha was neither as strong nor as young, but she knew the stones better than anyone alive. The wall rose slowly through the weeks of May. The first course was the foundation course laid directly on the ground that Daniel had cleared of vegetation and leveled with a spade. The foundation stones were the largest and heaviest, the stones that would bear the weight of everything above them and would resist the frost heave that threatened every structure built on Connecticut soil. Frost heave was the enemy of every New England wall. When the ground froze in winter, the moisture in the soil expanded and pushed upward. When the ground thawed in spring, the expanded soil settled back down. This annual cycle of freezing and thawing could move stones several inches over the course of a decade. A wall that was not built to resist frost heave would gradually shift and lean and eventually collapse. The Windham County tradition had developed techniques to resist frost heave over 2 centuries of trial and error. The most important technique was the interlocking course. Each stone in a wall had to span the joint between the 2 stones below it, so that there was no continuous vertical joint running through the wall's height. A continuous vertical joint was a line of weakness. The frost heave would push different sections of the wall by different amounts, and the wall would split along the vertical joint and fall apart. Martha knew this. She had watched walls with continuous vertical joints fail. She had watched walls with interlocking joints survive. She selected each stone to ensure that the joints in each course were offset from the joints in the course below. The work was slow. 60 feet of wall at 5 feet of height represented approximately 90 cubic feet of stone per running foot. The total volume was approximately 5,400 cubic feet, weighing approximately 220 tons. Moving 220 tons of stone by hand, 1 stone at a time, fitting each stone into its proper position, was the work of months. By the end of May, the wall was 1 foot high along its entire 60-foot length. By the end of June, the wall was 2.5 feet high. The laborers worked 6 days per week from dawn until the midday dinner, and then from early afternoon until the light failed. Daniel worked alongside them, carrying the heavier stones that required 2 men mixing the occasional batch of lime wash that Martha used to mark the positions where stones should be placed. Martha walked the stone pile each morning. She walked the growing wall each evening. She counted the courses and measured the height and recorded the progress in her journal with the same precision she had applied to counting firewood. The neighbors watched. Silas Brennan rode past on his way to the village at least once per week, slowing his horse to observe the construction. He did not stop to speak. He did not offer assistance or advice. He simply watched his face, wearing an expression that might have been curiosity or skepticism, or the simple satisfaction of a man who expected to be proven right about the wall's futility. Calvin Moore stopped by once in late June, ostensibly to discuss a property line question that had been unresolved since Hiram's death. He spent more time looking at the wall than discussing the property line. "It is coming along," he said, which was the kind of neutral observation that could be interpreted as praise or criticism depending on the listener's disposition. "It is," Martha agreed. 2.5 feet now. Another 2.5 to go. Yes. Calvin looked at the wall for a long moment. The wall looked back at him, 2.5 feet of interlocked fieldstone extending 60 feet across the north side of the Whitfield farmyard. "You still believe this will redirect the wind," he said. "I do not believe it," Martha replied. "I have observed it. The Crawford Ridge redirects the wind. This wall will do the same. The Crawford Ridge is 30 feet high. The Crawford Ridge protects buildings that are 50 feet tall. My wall is 5 feet high. My buildings are 12 feet tall at the eave. The proportion is similar. Calvin considered this. Martha could see him working through the arithmetic in his head, comparing the ratios, trying to find the flaw in her reasoning. He could not find it. "We will see," he said finally. "We will see." He rode away without resolving the property line question. The wall continued to rise. July brought the hottest days of the summer, and with them a change in the construction schedule. The men worked in the early morning and the late afternoon, avoiding the midday heat that made heavy labor dangerous. The pace slowed, but the wall continued to grow. 3 feet by mid-July, 3.5 feet by the end of the month. The stone pile along the east field border was visibly diminished. Martha had begun selecting stones from the north field pile as well, walking a longer distance each morning to find the pieces she needed for the increasingly demanding upper courses. The upper courses were more difficult than the lower courses. At 4 and 5 feet of height, the stones had to be lifted rather than simply placed. Daniel and the laborers used wooden levers to raise the heavier pieces, positioning them on the growing wall with the careful precision that the interlocking joints required. Martha supervised every placement. She stood beside the wall with her arms crossed, watching as each stone was lowered into position, calling out adjustments when the alignment was not correct. Turn it a quarter rotation to the left. The flat face needs to be on the outside. Move it 3 inches toward the east. It is sitting on the joint instead of spanning it. That stone does not fit there. Bring me the wedge-shaped piece from the morning pile, the triangular one with the split face. The laborers obeyed. They had learned by August that Martha's instructions were not suggestions. She knew the wall better than they did. She knew the stones better than they did. She knew what would work and what would fail. And her knowledge was the difference between a wall that would stand for decades and a wall that would collapse in the first hard winter. Daniel had learned this as well. He had spent the summer watching his mother select stones and position stones and reject stones that did not fit her specifications. He had begun to see what she saw when she looked at a pile of fieldstone. He had begun to understand the shapes and the relationships and the way that particular pieces fit particular positions. "You are learning to read the stones," Martha said to him one evening in late August as they walked the completed sections of the wall in the fading light. "I am trying," Daniel said. "You placed the crossing stone in the 4th course without my telling you where it should go. It seemed obvious. The joint below was in the center of the section. The crossing stone needed to span it." Martha nodded. "That is reading. You saw the joint. You understood what stone was needed. You found the stone and placed it correctly. I have been watching you do it for 4 months. Your father watched me do it for 30 years. He never learned." Daniel was quiet for a moment. The mention of his father was still difficult, still raw, after nearly 2 years. "He was not interested in walls," Daniel said finally. "No, he was interested in crops and livestock and the price of corn at the Hartford market. Walls were things that already existed when he inherited the farm. He maintained them. He did not think about them. And you thought about them. I thought about everything. I still do. It is how I am made." They reached the end of the completed section, where the wall stood 4 feet and 3 courses high, waiting for the final course that would bring it to its full 5-foot height. "The capstones go on next week," Martha said. "The large, flat stones I have been setting aside since May. They will finish the wall. And then we wait for winter. We see what the wind does when it encounters the wall. We measure the difference. And if there is no difference..." Martha looked at her son. His face was serious, his eyes holding the question that he had been carrying since April, since the church gathering where Silas Brennan had compared her plan to building a dam to hold back the rain. "There will be a difference," she said. "The wind cannot pass through 5 feet of stone. It has to go somewhere. The somewhere is above the wall. The somewhere is above our buildings." "You are certain?" I observed the Crawford Ridge. The snow fell at a different angle on each side. The wind was different on each side. The physics does not change because the barrier is man-made instead of glacially deposited. Daniel nodded slowly. He did not fully understand the physics his mother was describing, but he had spent 4 months watching her build a wall with the precision and confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. He had learned to trust that precision. He had learned to trust that confidence. "Next week," he said. "The capstones." "Next week," Martha agreed. The north wall was completed on October 15th, 1858. The final capstone was a piece of flat granite approximately 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 6 inches thick. It weighed over 100 pounds, and it required Daniel and both laborers to lift it into position on the wall's west end, where it locked the final course into place with the solid permanence that 60 years of accumulated fieldstone could provide. Martha watched the placement from the ground. She had selected this particular stone 6 months earlier, identifying it in the east field pile on the second day of construction and setting it aside for this specific purpose. It was the largest flat stone on the farm, and it belonged on the wall's most visible position, where anyone approaching from the west would see it first. The stone settled into place with a sound that was almost musical. A deep, solid thunk of weight finding its proper resting position. "Done," Daniel said, stepping back from the wall. "Done." Thomas Meeker agreed. "Done." John Slade confirmed. Martha did not speak. She walked along the base of the completed wall, running her hand across the stone she had selected and positioned over 5 months of labor. The wall was rough to the touch, the natural surfaces of the fieldstone unsmoothed by any tool. But it was solid. It was substantial. It was 60 feet of barrier standing 5 feet high against the northwest wind that would begin arriving in another month. The laborers left the following day. Martha paid them their final wages and thanked them for their work, and watched them walk down the farm road toward Eastford and the next job and the rest of their lives. Daniel stood beside her as they disappeared around the bend. "They think we built a wall to nowhere," he said. "They think we built a wall with no purpose they can understand." "Is that different?" "Yes, a wall to nowhere would be pointless. A wall with a purpose they cannot understand is simply beyond their experience. The purpose exists, whether they understand it or not." Daniel considered this. And if Silas Brennan is right, if the wind simply goes over the wall and continues as before, then we will have built a very solid wall that serves no useful function. Martha smiled slightly. "But Silas Brennan is not right. The wind will go over the wall. That is exactly what I want it to do. Going over the wall means going over the cabin and barn. Going over the cabin and barn means not going through the cabin and barn. The wind will be above us instead of around us. Yes, exactly that. The autumn of 1858 passed slowly, the way autumns always passed on a Connecticut farm. There was the harvest to complete, and the livestock to prepare for winter, and the 100 small repairs that needed to be finished before the ground froze. And there was the wall to watch. Martha watched it every day. She watched the morning mist curl around its base. She watched the afternoon sun cast its shadow across the farmyard. She watched the evening wind, the gentle October wind that would become the fierce November wind, and the killing December wind touch the wall's north face and rise. She could see the wind rising, not literally, of course. Wind was invisible, but the leaves that the wind carried were not invisible, and she watched them approach the wall from the north, and then lift, rising above the wall's height, and continuing southward at an altitude that cleared the cabin roof by several feet. The leaves were going somewhere else. The wind was going somewhere else. The wall was working, but leaves were not proof. Leaves were observation. Proof would require the winter wind, the sustained northwest wind that came down from Canada and pressed against everything in its path with the relentless force of continental weather patterns. Proof would require measurement. Martha waited. The winter of 1858 to 59 was a mild winter by Windham County standards. The temperature rarely dropped below zero, and the sustained northwest winds that Martha needed for her measurements arrived only twice in late December and mid-February. Both times she conducted her observations. The December observation was informal. She simply stood in the farmyard during a northwest blow and felt the difference. On the north side of the wall, the wind was fierce, pressing against her body with the force she had felt on the Crawford Ridge 2 years earlier. On the south side of the wall, the wind was reduced, present but reduced. Perhaps half the force, perhaps less. She noted the observation in her journal, but did not attempt to quantify it. The February observation was more systematic. She had been thinking about measurement for months. The problem was that she had no instruments, no anemometer to measure wind speed, no pressure gauge to measure the force of the wind against a surface, no scientific apparatus of any kind. But she had smoke. The woodshed chimney produced smoke whenever the stove inside was burning. The smoke rose from the chimney and was immediately captured by whatever wind was blowing across the farmyard. The direction and angle of the smoke showed the direction and relative speed of the wind. On the north side of the wall, where the full northwest wind was blowing, the smoke from a small fire would be driven nearly horizontal. The wind was strong enough to overwhelm the smoke's natural tendency to rise. On the south side of the wall, where the wind was reduced, the smoke from the same fire would rise at an angle. The wind was still present, still pushing the smoke to the southeast. But the smoke's vertical rise was no longer overwhelmed by the horizontal push. Martha tested this on February 14, 1859, during a sustained northwest wind that had been blowing for 2 days. She built a small fire in a metal bucket on the north side of the wall. The smoke drove horizontal, streaming away to the southeast at an angle of perhaps 10 degrees above horizontal. She carried the same bucket, still smoking around the wall to the south side. The smoke rose at an angle of approximately 45 degrees. The wind was still pushing it to the southeast, but the push was reduced by at least half. She estimated the wind speed reduction at approximately 50 to 60%. The wind on the south side of the wall was perhaps half of what it was on the north side. This was not as much reduction as she had hoped for. The Crawford Ridge produced a greater reduction, perhaps 70 or 80%. But the Crawford Ridge was 30 feet high and her wall was only 5 feet high. Still, 50% reduction was significant. 50% less wind meant significantly less heat loss through the cabin walls. 50% less wind meant significantly less cold air infiltrating through the gaps in the boards. She noted the observation in her journal and waited for the fuel consumption data that would confirm or refute her measurements. The fuel consumption data from the winter of 1858 to 59 was inconclusive. The mild winter had reduced everyone's firewood consumption. The Whitfield farm burned 3 cords down from the 3.5 cord average of previous years. But the Crawford farm burned only 2 cords, also down from its 2.5 cord average. The difference was still 1 cord. The wall did not seem to have closed the gap. Martha studied the numbers for weeks, trying to understand what they meant. Had the wall failed? Had Silas Brennan been right after all? Gradually, she realized the problem. The wall was incomplete. The north wall was blocking the direct northwest wind, but the wind was curling around the ends of the wall and entering the farmyard from the east and west sides. The return walls that she had designed, the 20-foot walls turning south from the main wall's east and west ends, had not been built. The wind was finding a way in. The wind was going somewhere else as she had intended, but somewhere else was around the wall instead of over the wall. The cabin and barn were still exposed to wind that came in from the sides. She needed to complete the design. The summer of 1859 was the summer of the return walls. Daniel built them with the same 2 laborers, though Thomas Meeker had moved to Massachusetts and been replaced by his younger brother William. The work proceeded faster than the north wall construction because the return walls were shorter and because Daniel had refined his technique over the previous summer's 60 feet. 20 feet on the east end turning south toward the farm road, 20 feet on the west end turning south toward the barn. The 3 walls together formed the U-shape that Martha had drawn in her journal 18 months earlier. A wind barrier opened to the south, enclosing the protected zone where the cabin barn and woodshed sat. The return walls were completed by September 1859. Martha stood in the center of the enclosed farmyard on the day the final stone was placed. The north wall rose behind her, 5 feet of fieldstone blocking the direct path of the northwest wind. The east and west return walls extended to her left and right, preventing the wind from curling around the main wall's ends. She was standing in the wind shadow. She was standing in the zone where the wind was supposed to be reduced, where the heat loss was supposed to be minimized, where the firewood consumption was supposed to drop. She would know by spring whether she was right. The winter of 1859 to 60 was not a mild winter. The first sustained northwest blizzard arrived on December 3rd and lasted for 4 days. The temperature dropped to 15 below zero. The wind howled across the Connecticut hills with the force of something that had traveled 1,000 miles without encountering any obstacle worth remembering. Martha watched the blizzard through the cabin window on the second day. The snow was driving horizontal outside the north wall. She could see it streaming past, a white blur of ice crystals moving at the speed of the wind. Inside the cabin, the candle on the table burned steadily. The flame did not flicker. The drafts that had plagued the cabin in previous winters, the infiltration through the north wall board gaps, were barely perceptible. She held her hand near the gap between two boards on the north wall. In previous winters, she would have felt a distinct cold draft pushing through the gap, the pressure differential forcing outside air into the cabin. Now she felt almost nothing, a slight coolness, a whisper of movement, but not the insistent pressure of the wind forcing its way through. The wall was working. Martha put on her coat and went outside. The contrast was immediate and dramatic. On the north side of the wall, the full blizzard was raging. The wind drove snow into her face so hard that she could barely keep her eyes open. The cold was the killing cold, the cold that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. She walked around the wall to the south side. The wind was present. She could feel it. But it was a different wind. A reduced wind. A wind that pushed against her coat instead of trying to tear it off her body. She looked at the woodshed chimney. The smoke was rising at an angle of approximately 45 degrees, just as it had in her February 1859 test. She estimated the wind speed at approximately 25 to 30% of the full blizzard wind. 25 to 30% of the wind meant approximately 6% of the wind pressure, because pressure was proportional to the square of velocity. A wind at 25% speed exerted only about 6% of the pressure. 6% of the pressure meant approximately 94% less infiltration through the cabin walls. 94% less infiltration meant dramatically less heat loss. Martha stood in the reduced wind of the protected zone and felt the difference on her skin. The wall was working. The stones had made the wind go somewhere else. Somewhere else was above the barn. Somewhere else was above the cabin. Somewhere else was the sky that the wind now traveled through instead of the farmyard it had previously dominated. She went back inside and recorded the observation in her journal. December 4th, 1859. Full northwest blizzard. Wind speed on south side of wall approximately 25 to 30% of wind speed on north side. Smoke test confirms 45-degree angle. Candle test at north wall board gap shows minimal infiltration. The wall is performing as designed. The fuel consumption numbers from the winter of 1859 to 60 confirmed what the smoke test had demonstrated. The Whitfield farm burned 2 3/4 cords of firewood, 3/4 of a cord, less than the pre-barrier average of 3.5 cords. The Crawford farm, protected by its natural ridge, burned approximately 2.5 cords in the same winter. The gap had closed. The 1-cord difference that had puzzled Hiram for 40 years was now a 1/4 cord difference. The stone barrier had brought the Whitfield farm to within a 1/4 cord of the ridge-protected farm's consumption. Martha recorded the numbers in her journal and calculated the savings. At the Windham County cordwood price of $1.25 per cord, the annual saving was approximately 90 cents. Not a fortune, but consistent, reliable, permanent. The wall would provide the same wind shadow next winter, and the winter after that, and the winter after that. For as long as the wall stood, the wind would go somewhere else. The construction had cost approximately $18 in hired labor over 2 summers. The stone itself was free, already present on the farm, requiring only labor to move it from the field borders to the wall site. $18 for a permanent reduction in fuel consumption. 22 years to recover the construction cost in fuel savings alone. But the wall would last longer than 22 years. A well-built, dry-laid fieldstone wall could last centuries. The walls that surrounded the farms of Windham County included walls built in the 1600s, walls that had been standing for 200 years and showed no signs of failing. Martha had not built a 22-year investment. She had built a permanent feature of the farm, a permanent change in the relationship between the Whitfield buildings and the Connecticut wind. $18 for a shadow that would last as long as the stones remained stacked. It was, as she noted in her journal, the right way to spend $18 on a farm that expected to operate for generations. February 1860 brought the proof that Martha had been waiting for, not in numbers. She already had the numbers. The fuel consumption data was clear. The cost calculation was complete. What February brought was a witness. Silas Brennan rode up to the Whitfield farm on February 23rd, during the worst northwest blizzard of the winter. He had come, he said, to check on the widow and her son, to make sure they had survived the storm that had been raging for 2 days. Martha knew this was not the real reason. Silas had not checked on her during any previous blizzard. Silas had been waiting as she had been waiting for the evidence that would prove one of them right and the other wrong. She invited him inside. He declined, saying he needed to see something first. He walked to the north side of the stone wall. Martha followed him wrapped in her heaviest coat, leaning into the wind that struck the wall's north face with the full force of the Canadian blizzard. Silas stood in the wind for a long moment. He watched the smoke from the woodshed chimney drive horizontal, streaming away to the southeast at an angle barely above parallel to the ground. Then he walked around the wall to the south side. He stood in the reduced wind of the protected zone. He watched the same smoke rise at a 45-degree angle, pushed by the wind, but not overwhelmed by it. He pressed his hand into the smoke stream. The smoke bent only slightly around his fingers. He walked back to the north side and pressed his hand into the smoke stream there. The smoke drove around his hand with enough force to feel like a solid push. He came back to the south side. He stood beside Martha in the wind shadow of the wall she had built. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said the words that Martha had been waiting 22 months to hear. The wall does not stop the wind. Martha nodded. No. But the wind does not come through. No. Silas looked at the wall. He looked at the smoke. He looked at Martha. How? He asked. Martha had been preparing this explanation since April 1858, when she had first tried to articulate what she was doing and had been met with incomprehension and mockery. "The stones do not stop the wind," she said. "They make it go somewhere else." Silas was quiet. "Somewhere else," he repeated slowly. "When the wind hits the wall, it cannot pass through. 5 feet of fieldstone is solid. The wind has to go somewhere. It goes up, over the wall, above the wall's height. Above the wall is above the cabin. Yes. The wind that was hitting the cabin is now passing over the cabin. The cabin is in the space where the wind used to be, but the wind is no longer there. The wind is above." Silas looked up as if he could see the invisible wind passing overhead. "Somewhere else is over the barn," he said. Martha felt something shift in her chest. Something that had been tight for 22 months, ever since Silas had compared her plan to building a dam to hold back the rain. "Yes," she said. That is exactly right. Somewhere else is over the barn. Silas nodded slowly. He looked at the wall again. 60 feet of fieldstone standing 5 feet high against the northwest wind. 2 return walls extending 20 feet each, completing the U-shape that enclosed the protected zone. "How much firewood did you save?" he asked. "3/4 of a cord this winter. The gap between my consumption and Crawford's has closed from 1 cord to a 1/4 cord." "At what cost?" $18 in hired labor over 2 summers. The stone was already here. Silas did the arithmetic in his head. Martha could see him calculating the same way she had calculated. 22 years to recover the cost, he said. If the wall only lasts 22 years. If the wall lasts 200 years, the recovery is much faster. Silas smiled slightly. It was the first smile Martha had seen on his face since Hiram's funeral. "The wall will last 200 years, he said. "It is well built. I can see the interlocking courses from here. Whoever selected your stones knew what they were doing." "I selected the stones." Silas looked at her. "I've been reading the stone piles on this farm for 40 years, Martha said. Daniel and the laborers carried. I selected. The selection is the skill." Silas was quiet for a long moment. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "In April of '58, I compared your plan to building a dam to hold back the rain. I said the wind would go straight over your wall and continue exactly as before. The wind does go over my wall, but it does not continue as before. It continues above your buildings instead of through them. That is the difference I did not understand." Martha nodded. "You were not entirely wrong," she said. "The wind does go over the wall. You simply did not follow the thought to its conclusion. Over the wall means over the cabin. Over the cabin means not through the cabin. The wall does not stop the wind. It redirects the wind. The destination of the redirected wind is the sky above my barn instead of the walls of my cabin." Silas shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, but in something like wonder. "I have been farming in this county for 30 years, he said. "I have built walls for boundaries and walls for livestock enclosures and walls to mark property lines. I have never built a wall to redirect the wind. Neither had I until 2 years ago." "What made you think of it?" "The Crawford Ridge. I walked up to it during a blizzard in January of '58. I held snow in my hand on the north side and watched it drive horizontal. I held snow on the south side and watched it fall at an angle. The ridge was doing something to the wind. I realized that a wall could do the same thing. But the ridge is 30 feet high. Your wall is 5 feet. The ridge protects buildings that are 50 feet tall. My wall protects buildings that are 12 feet tall. The proportion is similar." Silas considered this. His face wore an expression Martha had never seen before. Not skepticism, not mockery. Something that might have been respect. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I came here today expecting to find that the wall had failed. I came expecting to confirm what I believed in April of '58. Instead, I find that you were right and I was wrong." Martha did not gloat. She did not remind him of the mockery or the dismissal or the confident predictions of failure. "The evidence was not available in April of '58, she said. "You made a reasonable judgment based on the information you had. The information was incomplete. Now it is complete. The information is the smoke test and the fuel consumption. Yes. The smoke test shows the wind reduction. The fuel consumption confirms the heat savings. The two measurements together prove the mechanism. Silas nodded. He looked at the wall one more time. 60 feet of fieldstone standing between the northwest wind and the Whitfield cabin. "I will think about this," he said. "I may have questions later. You are welcome to come back whenever you wish. I can show you the journal entries, the measurements, the cost calculations. Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield." He mounted his horse and rode away through the blizzard, following the farm road back toward his own property. Martha stood in the wind shadow of the wall she had built and watched him go. The wind continued to blow. The snow continued to fall. The smoke continued to rise at 45 degrees from the woodshed chimney. The stones had made the wind go somewhere else. Somewhere else was over the barn. The cabin and barn were below the somewhere else. The cold was above them. The stones had put it there. The news traveled through Windham County the way all news traveled through rural Connecticut in 1860. Slowly at first passed from one farmhouse to the next during Sunday church gatherings and Wednesday market days, and the chance encounters on the roads between properties. Then, faster as the story accumulated details, and the details accumulated believers, and the believers accumulated questions that could only be answered by seeing the wall for themselves. Silas Brennan had seen the smoke test. Silas Brennan had pressed his hand into the smoke on both sides of the wall and felt the difference. Silas Brennan had spoken the words that Martha had been waiting to hear since April of 1858. Somewhere else is over the barn. By March of 1863, other farmers had visited the Whitfield farm to see the wall. By April, the number had grown to 7. By the time the snow melted and the spring planting began, there was hardly a farm in northeastern Windham County that had not heard about the widow Whitfield and her stone wind barrier. The reactions varied. Some farmers came, looked at the wall, listened to Martha's explanation, and left unconvinced. The wall was just a wall, they said. The wind was just the wind. The fact that the Whitfield farm had burned less firewood this winter proved nothing except that this winter had been different from other winters. Wait until next year, they said. Wait until a truly harsh winter. Then we will see what the wall does. Some farmers came, looked at the wall, listened to Martha's explanation, and left confused. They understood that the wall was supposed to redirect the wind. They understood that redirecting the wind was supposed to reduce heat loss. But they could not connect these concepts to the physical reality of stone and air and temperature. The mechanism was too abstract. The physics was too invisible. But some farmers came, looked at the wall, listened to Martha's explanation, and understood. These were the farmers who had spent their lives paying attention to the small details of their land. The farmers who knew which fields drained faster after a rain and why. The farmers who knew which fence posts rotted first and what that said about the moisture in the soil. The farmers who had learned through decades of observation that the physical world operated according to patterns that could be understood and once understood could be used. These farmers looked at the smoke rising at 45 degrees on the south side of the wall. They looked at the smoke driving horizontal on the north side. They understood that the difference in the smoke's behavior represented a difference in the wind's behavior, and that the difference in the wind's behavior represented a difference in the heat loss from the buildings. They understood that Martha had not stopped the wind. She had made it go somewhere else. Calvin Moore was one of these farmers. He came to the Whitfield farm in late April of 1860 after the spring thaw had turned the roads to mud, and the mud had dried enough for travel. He came alone without the accompaniment of Silas Brennan or any other neighbor, and he came with a question that he had been carrying since February. "I have been thinking about what Silas told me," he said, standing beside Martha at the base of the north wall. "About the smoke test, about the wind going over instead of through." "Yes," Martha said. "I have been thinking about my own farm. My cabin sits lower on the slope than yours, but I have no ridge to protect me. The northwest wind strikes my north wall directly the same as it struck yours before you built this barrier. Yes, I burn approximately 3 cords per winter, sometimes more in a harsh year, sometimes less in a mild year, but the average is 3 cords. Martha nodded. She knew Calvin's consumption. She had been comparing fuel consumption across the neighboring farms for 4 years now, building a mental map of who burned what and why. "If I build a wall like this one," Calvin said slowly, "how much would I save?" "That depends on the specific conditions of your site, the height of your buildings, the distance from the wall to the buildings, the angle at which the northwest wind strikes your property. But approximately, in general terms." Martha considered the question. Calvin's farm was similar to the Whitfield farm in many ways. Similar slope, similar exposure, similar construction of the cabin and barn. 3/4 of a cord, she said. Perhaps slightly less, perhaps slightly more, but approximately 3/4 of a cord per winter. Calvin was quiet for a long moment. "At $1.25 per cord," he said, "that is approximately 90 cents per year." "Yes. And the construction cost. I spent $18 on hired labor over 2 summers. The stone was already present on my land. If you have sufficient stone on your land, your costs would be similar. I have stone. Every farm in Windham County has stone. Then your cost would be approximately $18, perhaps $20 depending on the length of wall you require." Calvin did the arithmetic that every farmer in Windham County would eventually do. $18 divided by 90 cents per year. 20 years to recover the cost. But the wall would last longer than 20 years. The wall would last as long as the stones remained stacked. "It is a long recovery period," he said. "It is," Martha agreed. "But the recovery period assumes the wall provides no value beyond fuel savings. The wall also reduces wear on the cabin's north face. It reduces the infiltration that damages stored goods in the winter. It makes the cabin more comfortable during blizzards, which has value, even if that value cannot be measured in dollars. You are saying the true recovery period is shorter than 20 years. I am saying the true recovery period depends on how you value comfort and preservation and the other benefits that cannot be easily priced." Calvin nodded slowly. He looked at the wall. 60 feet of fieldstone standing 5 feet high against the northwest wind that would return in 7 months. "I will think about it," he said. He rode away without making a commitment, but Martha had seen the look in his eyes, the look of a man who was already calculating where on his property the wall should go. The winter of 1860 to 61 was a harsh winter. The first sustained northwest blizzard arrived in early December and lasted for 5 days. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero. colder than any temperature Martha could remember since her childhood. The wind howled across the Connecticut hills with a ferocity that seemed personal, as if the winter itself had decided to test the limits of human endurance. Martha watched the blizzard through her cabin window and felt something she had not felt during any previous harsh winter. She felt warm, not comfortable exactly. The cabin was still cold by any reasonable standard. The fire in the stove required constant feeding, and the temperature in the corners farthest from the stove dropped to levels that made sleep difficult without extra blankets. But the cabin was warmer than it should have been, warmer than it would have been without the wall. The wind that was raging outside the protected zone was not penetrating the cabin's north wall with the same force it had penetrated in previous winters. Martha held her hand near the gap between two boards on the north wall, the same gap she had tested during the previous winter's blizzards. The infiltration was minimal, a whisper of cold air, barely perceptible, not the insistent draft that had plagued the cabin before the wall was built. She recorded the observation in her journal. December 8, 1860. Severe northwest blizzard. 5th day. Temperature approximately -20. Why? Wind speed on north side of wall estimated at 40 miles per hour or greater. Wind speed on south side of wall estimated at 10 to 12 miles per hour. Infiltration through north wall board gap barely perceptible. Cabin maintaining temperature with normal fuel consumption despite extreme conditions. The fuel consumption data from that winter confirmed the observation. The Whitfield farm burned 3 cords of firewood during the winter of 1860 to 61. 3 cords in a winter that was significantly harsher than the previous winter when the farm had burned 2 3/4 cords. But 3 cords in a harsh winter was still less than the 3.5 cords the farm had averaged before the wall was built. The wall was providing protection even in extreme conditions. The wall was maintaining its performance even when the wind was at its most severe. The Crawford farm, protected by its natural ridge, burned 2 3/4 cords in the same winter. The gap between the Whitfield consumption and the Crawford consumption remained at approximately 1/4 cord. The wall was working. The wall continued to work. Spring 1861 brought the event that Martha had been hoping for since the February 1860 smoke test. Silas Brennan began building his own stone wind barrier. The news reached Martha through Daniel, who had heard it from the hired hand, who had been engaged to assist with the construction. Silas was building a north wall on his property, 50 feet long and 5 feet high, positioned to protect his cabin and barn from the northwest wind. Martha received the news with a feeling she could not quite identify. Not triumph exactly, not vindication. Something quieter, something that felt like the completion of a long equation. 3 years earlier, Silas had compared her plan to building a dam to hold back the rain. He had said that a 5-foot wall would not stop a wind that was 100 feet tall. He had predicted that the wall would fail, and that her labor would be wasted, and that the wind would continue exactly as it had always continued. Now he was building a wall of his own. 3 years from mockery to adoption. The evidence had been sufficient. Martha walked to the Brennan farm in late May, when the construction was underway, and the first course of the wall was visible above the cleared ground. She found Silas standing beside the growing wall, watching 2 hired laborers carry stones from a pile near his east field. He saw her approaching and straightened his posture, as if preparing for a confrontation. But Martha had not come to confront. She had come to observe. "Mrs. Whitfield," Silas said. "Mr. Brennan, I suppose you have come to see the dam I am building to hold back the rain." Martha smiled slightly. "I have come to see the wall you are building to redirect the wind." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled as well, a small and rueful smile that acknowledged the distance between what he had predicted and what he was now doing. "I was wrong," he said. "In April of '58, I was wrong. I have spent 2 years watching your smoke rise at 45 degrees while mine drives horizontal. I have spent 2 years watching your fuel consumption drop while mine remains the same. The evidence was sufficient. The evidence was overwhelming. Evidence often is," Martha said. "The question is whether we are willing to see it. I was not willing at first. I thought I knew how the wind worked. I thought I knew what a wall could and could not do. I was wrong about both." Martha walked along the first course of Silas's wall. The stones were well selected, large and flat for the foundation, fitted together with the interlocking joints that would resist frost heave. "You have good stone," she said. "I have been reading the stone piles on my land for 30 years. I know which pieces fit where. That is the skill. The laborers can carry. The farmer must select." Silas nodded. "May I ask you something, Mrs. Whitfield?" "Of course." "When you first conceived of this wall, before you built it, before you tested it, before you had any evidence that it would work, how did you know?" Martha considered the question. "I did not know," she said. "I observed. I walked to the Crawford Ridge during a blizzard and held snow in my hand on both sides. I saw that the snow behaved differently on each side. I concluded that the ridge was doing something to the wind. I hypothesized that a wall could do the same thing. Then I built the wall and tested the hypothesis." "But you spent $18 and 2 summers of labor on a hypothesis." "Yes, that is a significant investment in an idea that might have been wrong." Martha looked at Silas. He was 58 years old now, 3 years older than he had been when he had mocked her plan at the church gathering. 3 years of watching and measuring and eventually understanding. "Every decision is an investment in an idea that might be wrong," she said. "The question is not whether the idea might be wrong. The question is whether the evidence supports the idea and whether the potential benefit justifies the risk. And you believe the evidence supported your idea. The Crawford Ridge was evidence. The snow test was evidence. The physics was evidence, even though I did not have the formal language to describe it. The wind cannot pass through solid stone. The wind must go somewhere when it encounters an obstacle. The somewhere is above the obstacle. These facts were sufficient to justify the experiment." Silas was quiet for a long moment. "I have been a farmer for 30 years, he said finally. "I have made thousands of decisions based on evidence and experience and the accumulated wisdom of the generations before me. But I have never made a decision like the one you made. I have never built something entirely new based on an observation that no one else had made. The observation was available to anyone who walked to the Crawford Ridge during a blizzard. I was simply the one who walked. No Mrs. Whitfield. The observation was available. The conclusion was not. Anyone could have seen the snow fall at different angles on each side of the ridge. You were the one who understood what that difference meant. You were the one who saw the wall inside the ridge." Martha did not respond. There was nothing to respond to. Silas was right, and they both knew it. She had seen something that others had not seen. She had understood something that others had not understood. And she had acted on that understanding despite the mockery and the skepticism and the confident predictions of failure. The wall she had built was standing on her farm, 5 feet of fieldstone redirecting the northwest wind. The wall Silas was building would soon be standing on his farm doing the same thing. The evidence had been sufficient. The idea was spreading. The winters accumulated. 1861 to 62. The Whitfield farm burned 2 7/8 cords. A severe winter, colder than average, but the wall maintained its protection. The gap with the Crawford farm remained at approximately 1/4 cord. 1862 to 63. The Whitfield farm burned 3 cords. The coldest February on record, with temperatures dropping to 25 below zero. The wall performed as expected, maintaining the wind shadow even in extreme conditions. 1863 to 64. The Whitfield farm burned 2.5 cords. A mild winter, the mildest since the wall was built. The Crawford farm burned approximately the same. The gap had closed almost entirely. 1864 to 65. The Whitfield farm burned 2 5/8 cords. A normal winter, average temperatures, average wind. The wall continued its steady performance. 1865 to 66. The Whitfield farm burned 2 3/4 cords. The 7th winter with the complete barrier. The data was now sufficient for statistical confidence. Martha recorded each winter's consumption in her journal. She calculated the averages and the variances and the trends. She compared her data with the Crawford farm's consumption and with the consumption of other farms in the area. The 7-winter average was clear. Pre-barrier consumption 3.5 cords per winter. Post-barrier consumption 2 3/4 cords per winter. Average, saving 3/4 of a cord per winter. At $1.25 per cord, the annual saving was approximately 90 cents. At 90 cents per year, the $18 construction cost would be recovered in approximately 22 years. But the wall would not stop working after 22 years. The wall would continue to provide the same wind shadow for as long as the stones remained stacked. A well-built, dry-laid fieldstone wall could last for centuries. The walls that had been built in the earliest years of European settlement in New England were still standing still, functional, still serving the purposes for which they had been constructed. Martha had not built a 22-year investment. She had built a permanent feature of the farm, a permanent change in the relationship between the Whitfield buildings and the wind that had been blowing across this land for 10,000 years. $18 for a shadow that would protect the farm for generations. $18 for the stones that made the wind go somewhere else. The physics of the wind barrier, which Martha had understood empirically from the smoke test and the snow test, could be stated with the precision of the wind engineering that would be formalized in the 20th century, 100 years after Martha's death. When wind encounters a solid barrier, it cannot pass through the barrier. It must go over, around, or be stopped entirely against the windward face. For a barrier tall enough to force the wind above the obstacles behind it, the aerodynamic effect is the creation of a separation zone behind the barrier, a region of reduced wind speed that extends downwind from the barrier's lee face. The separation zone extends approximately 10 to 15 times the barrier's height before the wind flow reattaches to the surface and the wind speed recovers to its undisturbed value. For Martha's 5-foot wall, the separation zone extended approximately 50 to 75 feet behind the wall. The Whitfield cabin and barn were within 25 feet of the wall's south face, well within the protected zone. Within the separation zone, the wind speed at ground level was approximately 20 to 30% of the undisturbed wind speed. This was consistent with Martha's estimate from the smoke test. The reduction from 100% wind speed to 25% wind speed represented a 94% reduction in wind pressure on the cabin's north face because wind pressure is proportional to the square of the wind speed. A wind at 25% of full speed exerts only 6% of the pressure of the full wind. This 94% reduction in wind pressure had two direct effects on the cabin's thermal performance. First, the infiltration through the cabin's north wall board gaps was proportional to the wind pressure differential across the wall. At 6% of full pressure, the infiltration was approximately 94% less than without the barrier. Second, the convective heat loss from the cabin's north wall surface was proportional to the wind speed. At 25% of full wind speed, the convective coefficient was reduced by approximately 75%, and the heat loss rate was correspondingly reduced. The combined effect of the reduced infiltration and the reduced convective heat loss through the north face explained the 3/4 chord reduction in fuel consumption that Martha had measured across 7 winters. Martha did not know the separation zone formula. She did not know the pressure-square relationship. She did not have the mathematical language that 20th century engineers would use to describe what she had built. But she knew the smoke rose at 45 degrees behind the wall, while it drove horizontal in front of the wall. She knew the candle flame near the north wall board gap barely moved during blizzards. She knew the fuel consumption comparison across 7 winters. The physics was in the result. The result was in the journal. The broader context of the stone wind barrier within the Windham County farming community was worth understanding because it illuminated the specific quality of Martha's innovation. Windham County had 2 centuries of field stone wall construction by 1860. Every farm had walls. The walls were boundary markers, field dividers, pasture enclosures, and livestock barriers. They were not in the traditional understanding windbreaks. The walls were generally low, 2 to 3 feet high, because that height was sufficient for their traditional functions. A wall that kept sheep from wandering into the neighbor's field did not need to be 5 feet high. A wall that marked the boundary between 2 properties did not need to block the wind. A wall built specifically to redirect the wind with no boundary or enclosure function was outside the established tradition. Martha's 5-foot north wall had no boundary function. It ran along the cabin's north side without demarcating any field or enclosing any livestock. The east and west return walls similarly had no traditional function. The 3 walls together formed a U-shaped enclosure with no gate, no entrance, and no purpose visible to a neighbor who understood walls only as boundary or enclosure structures. This was the source of Silas Brennan's mockery in 1858. He had seen a wall that demarcated nothing and enclosed nothing, and from the traditional wall function perspective, it was indeed a wall that did nothing. Martha had been building a function that was outside the Windham County wall tradition. Not boundary, not enclosure, but aerodynamic redirect. The tradition had no vocabulary for this. Silas had no frame of reference for it. The mockery was the response to something outside the known categories. By spring 1861, when Silas built his own north wall, the function had been demonstrated, and the vocabulary had been established. Somewhere else is over the barn. The stones redirect the wind. This was the new entry in the Windham County wall tradition. Not just boundary and enclosure, but wind redirect. The tradition had expanded to include Martha's innovation. The stones still did not stop the wind. They made it go somewhere else. The tradition now included that somewhere else. By 1865, 3 other farmers in northeastern Windham County had built stone wind barriers modeled on Martha's design. Calvin Moore had built his in the summer of 1862, a 40-foot wall with 15-foot return walls, protecting a cabin that had previously consumed 3 cords per winter. His first post-barrier winter showed a consumption of 2 1/4 cords, a saving of 3/4 of a cord, consistent with Martha's results. The technique was spreading. The evidence was accumulating. The innovation was becoming tradition. Martha watched this spreading with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been right about something important and had lived long enough to see others recognize that she had been right. She was 60 years old in 1866, the 7th year of the complete barrier. The year she completed her fuel consumption records for the account book. She had been running the Whitfield farm alone for 10 years with Daniel's labor but her own decisions. She had maintained the wall, repaired the occasional stone displaced by frost. Heave kept the protected zone clear of debris that might have disrupted the wind shadow. The wall was as solid as it had been when the last capstone was placed in October 1858. The interlocking courses had resisted 8 winters of frost heave. The capstones remained in place, flat and visible, marking the top of the barrier that had changed the farm's relationship with the wind. Daniel was 34 years old now. No longer the uncertain young man who had questioned his mother's judgment during the first summer of construction. He had learned to read the stone piles the way Martha read them. He had learned to select stones for the positions where their particular shapes would contribute to a wall's stability. He had learned the skill that his father had never learned, the skill that Martha had carried alone for 40 years. When Martha died, Daniel would inherit not just the farm, but the knowledge of how to build walls that redirected wind, the knowledge of how to select stones from the piles that the glaciers had deposited 10,000 years ago, the knowledge of how to make the wind go somewhere else. This was the inheritance that mattered, not the land which was just dirt and stone, not the buildings which would eventually decay and need replacement, but the knowledge which could be passed from generation to generation as long as there were people willing to learn. The stones do not stop the wind. They make it go somewhere else. This was the knowledge. This was the inheritance. This was what Martha had created in the summers of 1858 and 1859, when she had built a wall that no one else had imagined and that everyone had predicted would fail. The wall had not failed. The wall had succeeded. The wall was still standing still, redirecting the wind, still making the somewhere else that protected the cabin and barn from the northwest wind that would never stop blowing. The account book that Martha Whitfield kept from 1856 through 1867 was a single volume bound in brown leather, with her name inscribed on the inside cover, in the careful handwriting she had learned as a girl. The book contained the daily records of a working farm purchases and sales labor hired, and wages paid, livestock counted, and crops harvested. But it also contained the fuel consumption records, every winter from 1856 to 57 through 1866 to 67. The number of cords burned, the dates when new wood was brought from the pile, the comparisons with previous years. And it contained the construction records, the dates when work began and ended, the names of the laborers hired, the wages paid, the progress measured in feet of wall completed, and it contained the observations. The smoke test on December 4th, 1859. The candle test at the north wall board gap. The snow test on the Crawford Ridge in January 1858, when Martha had first understood what the ridge was doing to the wind. And it contained the key phrase, February 23rd, 1860. Silas Brennan visit during Northwest blizzard. Smoke test demonstration. SB observed smoke horizontal on north side, 45 degrees on south side. SB stated, "The wall does not stop the wind." I confirmed, "No." SB stated, "But the wind does not come through." I explained, "The stones do not stop the wind. They make it go somewhere else." SB silent for a long moment, then stated, "Somewhere else is over the barn." I confirmed, "Yes, that is exactly right. Somewhere else is over the barn." This entry was the record. This entry was the proof. This entry was the moment when the mechanism had been understood by someone other than Martha, when the innovation had passed from one mind to another, when the tradition had begun to expand. The account book remained in the Whitfield family for decades after Martha's death. It passed from Martha to Daniel, from Daniel to his son Thomas, from Thomas to his daughter Helen, who married a man named Wood and moved to Hartford in 1915. Helen Whitfield. Wood understood the significance of the book. She had grown up hearing stories about her great-grandmother, the widow who had built a wall that everyone said was pointless, and that had proved to be brilliant. She had seen the wall herself, still standing on the Whitfield farm in northeastern Windham County, still protecting the cabin and barn that her great-grandmother had protected 70 years earlier. In 1921, Helen donated the account book to the Connecticut State Library in Hartford. The donation was recorded in the library's acquisition register. 1 volume 1856 to 1867 farm accounts and personal observations. Whitfield family of Windham County. Donor Helen Whitfield Wood of Hartford. The book was cataloged and shelved and preserved with the care that libraries bring to primary historical documents. It sat in the Connecticut State Library for decades, waiting for someone to read it, waiting for someone to understand what it contained. The record was in Hartford. It was still there. The wall was in Windham County. It was still there. The wind still went somewhere else when it encountered the stones that Martha had stacked in the summers of 1858 and 1859. The separation zone still formed behind the wall, reducing the wind speed to approximately 25% of its undisturbed value. The cabin that Martha had protected was still protected, still sitting in the wind shadow that she had created. The physics had not changed. The physics would never change. When wind encountered a solid barrier, it had to go somewhere. The somewhere was above the barrier. The somewhere was above the buildings that sat behind the barrier. The stones did not stop the wind. They made it go somewhere else. Somewhere else was over the barn. The cold was above the buildings instead of through them. The stones had put it there. The broader significance of Martha Whitfield's stone wind barrier was not fully recognized during her lifetime. She was a widow who had built an unusual wall and had saved 3/4 of a cord of firewood per winter. She was a curiosity in Windham County, a woman who had understood something about wind and stone that the men around her had not understood. But she was not famous. She was not celebrated. She was not recognized as an innovator or a pioneer or any of the other titles that history sometimes grants to people who see what others do not see. She was simply Martha Whitfield, who had lived on a farm in northeastern Connecticut and had noticed that the wind behaved differently on different sides of a ridge. The recognition came later, much later, when historians began to study the material culture of 19th century New England and discovered the account books and journals that farm families had left behind. The recognition came when engineers began to study the vernacular architecture of rural America and discovered that farmers had been solving aerodynamic problems decades before formal wind engineering existed. The recognition came when someone read Martha's account book in the Connecticut State Library and understood what it contained. The stones do not stop the wind. They make it go somewhere else. This phrase was not just a description of a physical mechanism. It was a philosophy. It was an approach to problem solving that recognized the limits of force and the power of redirection. It was an understanding that sometimes the goal was not to stop something, but to guide it, not to block something, but to deflect it, not to fight something, but to make it go somewhere else. Martha had not tried to stop the wind. The wind was too powerful to stop. The wind had been blowing across Connecticut for 10,000 years and would continue blowing for 10,000 more. No wall that Martha could build would stop it. But Martha had not needed to stop the wind. She had only needed to redirect it. She had only needed to make it go over. Instead of through above, instead of around somewhere else, instead of here. The stones had done the work. The stones had stood in the path of the wind and had forced the wind to choose a different path. The stones had not stopped anything. The stones had simply been there, solid and immovable, and the wind had gone somewhere else because the wind could not pass through. This was the insight. This was the innovation. This was what Martha had understood on the Crawford Ridge in January 1858, and had spent the next 3 years proving to herself and to her neighbors. The wind goes somewhere else when it encounters something it cannot pass through. The somewhere else can be chosen. The somewhere else can be designed. The somewhere else can be built from the fieldstone that lies in every field in Windham County, waiting to be stacked into something useful. $18. 2 summers. 60 years of accumulated stone. A shadow that would last for centuries. The Connecticut State Library in Hartford, Connecticut, holds the Martha Whitfield Farm Account Book. 1 volume, 1856 through 1867. Donated by her granddaughter Helen Whitfield Wood in 1921. The 1858 construction entries are in the volume. The dates when work began, the laborers hired, the wages paid, the progress measured in feet and courses. The 7 winters of fuel consumption records are in the volume. The cords burned each year, the comparisons with previous years, the averages and the savings. The key phrase is in the volume. The February 1860 Silas Brennan visit entry. The smoke test. The conversation. The stones do not stop the wind. They make it go somewhere else. Somewhere else is over the barn. The record is in Hartford. It is still there. The stones are in Windham County. The wall that Martha built in 1858 and 1859 is still standing on the property that was the Whitfield farm. The capstones that she selected and positioned are still in place, flat and visible, marking the top of the barrier that she designed. The wind is still there. The northwest wind that comes down from Canada every winter is still blowing across the Connecticut hills, still pressing against every obstacle in its path, still looking for somewhere to go. When the wind reaches the Whitfield farm, it encounters the stones. The stones that Martha selected from the piles that 60 years of plowing had accumulated. The stones that Daniel and the laborers carried and that Martha positioned. The stones that have been standing for over 160 years, interlocked in the courses that 2 centuries of Windham County tradition had developed. The wind cannot pass through the stones. The wind has never been able to pass through the stones. The wind will never be able to pass through the stones. So the wind goes somewhere else. The wind rises. The wind passes over the wall. The wind continues southward at a higher altitude, passing over the buildings that sit in the shadow of the wall, passing over the farmyard where the smoke still rises at 45 degrees during northwest blizzards. Somewhere else is over the barn. The stones put it there. Martha Whitfield put it there. The record is in Hartford. It is still there. The stones are in Windham County. They are still there. The wind still goes somewhere else when the stones are in the way. It always did. It always will.